The Arizona Territory bore witness to its fair share of legendary figures during the untamed years of the 1870s. Wild Bill Hickok, Doc Holliday, and Annie Oakley all left their mark on these dusty lands. But perhaps none carried a more deceiving legacy than Sarah "Deadeye" McKenzie, whose very name once commanded whispered respect in every saloon from Tombstone to Tucson. A woman who'd outshot 27 of the West's deadliest gunfighters in her prime, and whose motto remained etched in the territory's memory. It ain't the speed of the draw that counts, it's the certainty of the shot. Join me today as we delve into the extraordinary tale of how Deadeye McKenzie, now a silver-haired widow of 72, reminded a gang of young outlaws that some legends never fade. They just age like fine whiskey. Before we dive deeper, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your soul, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's tale will leave you breathless. Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, summer of 1885. The town wasn't much to look at, a sun-bleached main street lined with weather-worn buildings, where hope and desperation played cards daily under the merciless desert sun. Most folks passed, through without a second glance, which suited the residents just fine. Among them, in a modest house at the edge of town, lived Sarah McKenzie, tending to her small garden and occasionally mending clothes for extra money. To the casual observer, she was just another elderly widow, her once auburn hair now steel grey, her hands gnarled from years of work. The younger generation knew nothing of her past, saw only the slight stoop in her shoulders, the reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. Even Sheriff Thomas Cooper, new to his badge, merely tipped his hat politely when passing her house, unaware that 30 years ago she'd taught his predecessor everything he knew about shooting. Dr. James Miller was perhaps the only person in town who knew the truth. He'd treated her arthritis for years, couldn't help but notice the telltale calluses on her trigger finger, the way her eyes still tracked movement with predatory precision. "Your hands troubling you much these days, Mrs. McKenzie?" he'd ask during his visits. Her reply was always the same: "Just enough to keep me honest, doctor. Just enough to keep me honest." The trouble rode into Copper Creek on a scorching Tuesday afternoon, 5 riders trailing dust clouds and attitude. Their leader, a young buck calling himself Quick Hand Carter, couldn't have been more than 25. He wore his gun belt low, frontier style, and carried himself with the cocksure swagger of someone who'd built a reputation on other men's fear rather than earned respect. The town watched warily as the riders dismounted outside the saloon, spurs singing against the wooden sidewalk. Sarah McKenzie observed them from her porch, her rocking chair creaking softly as she continued her knitting. Her old Winchester rifle, the one that had accompanied her through countless adventures, rested discreetly beside her chair, covered by a harmless-looking quilt. "Mighty hot day for knitting, ain't it, Grandma?" Carter's voice carried across the street, followed by his companion's snickers. Sarah's needles never missed a stitch as she replied, her voice carrying the soft lilt of her Virginia upbringing. "Never too hot to keep busy, young man. Your mama ought to have taught you that." The comment drew louder laughter from the gang, but something in Sarah's tone, a hint of steel beneath the genteel manner, made Carter's smile flicker briefly. He'd built his reputation on sizing up threats, and something about the old woman's calm demeanor set off warning bells he couldn't quite place. Inside the saloon, William "Billy" Jenkins, the elderly bartender, watched the scene unfold with growing concern. He was one of the few who remembered the stories, who'd actually witnessed Sarah McKenzie in her prime. He'd seen her shoot the ace of spades out of the air at 30 paces, watched her face down the infamous Clayton brothers when they tried to rob the bank in '56. But surely those days were long past, and Sarah was just another elderly widow now, wasn't she? As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Tension crept through Copper Creek like a morning fog. Carter's gang had spent the afternoon buying drinks with questionable coins and making increasingly pointed comments about the town's apparent lack of law enforcement. Sheriff Cooper was away in Tucson, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by the outlaws. Little did they know that Sarah McKenzie had spent the afternoon methodically cleaning her Winchester, her arthritic fingers moving with practiced precision while she hummed an old Virginia reel. Some habits, like some legends, die hard. Through the evening, the wind carried the sound of drunken revelry from the saloon, mingled with the occasional ping of spurs on weathered boards. Sarah McKenzie's porch sat empty, her rocking chair still swaying gently in the cooling breeze. As if recently vacated, the coming night promised to remind Copper Creek of why some legends are best left respected, not mocked. Night had barely settled over Copper Creek when Dr. Miller made his way to Sarah McKenzie's house, his medical bag in hand. The excuse of checking on her arthritis wasn't entirely a pretense. He'd seen how she'd gripped her knitting needles that afternoon, noticed the subtle tension in her weathered hands, but they both knew the real reason for his visit. "Them boys in the saloon," he said quietly, accepting a cup of coffee from her steady hands. "They're asking questions about the bank's schedule, about when the mine payroll's due." He studied her face in the lamplight, searching for any sign of concern. "Sheriff Cooper won't be back until Friday." Sarah settled into her familiar chair, her Winchester still within easy reach beneath the quilt. "Town's seen trouble before, Doctor," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "Remember the Clayton brothers? Everyone thought they were just passing through too." The doctor's expression darkened at the memory. "That was 30 years ago, Sarah. You were different then. We all were." He leaned forward, lowering his voice despite being alone in her parlor. "I've treated your hands for years now, the arthritis, the stiffness in your joints, and I appreciate your concern," she interrupted gently, "but some things don't fade with time. Some skills sink deeper than bone." She flexed her fingers thoughtfully, the joints cracking softly in the quiet room. "Besides, I didn't survive. All those years by being faster than the other fellow, I survived by being smarter." Outside, the sounds from the saloon had grown louder. Quick-hand Carter's voice carried clearly through the evening air, boasting about some supposed gunfight in Texas. Sarah and the doctor shared a knowing look. They'd both heard enough real gunfighters to recognize hollow bravado. "Billy Jenkins. He sent word," Miller continued, setting down his coffee cup. "Says Carter's gang has been asking particular questions about you. About the old widow who lives at the edge of town. Seems they noticed your house has a clear view of both the bank and the main road out of town." Sarah's eyes, still sharp despite her years, glinted in the lamplight. Did they now? Imagine that. She rose slowly, moving to a worn dresser in the corner. From the bottom drawer, she withdrew a wooden box, its surface smooth from years of handling. "Doctor, would you mind helping an old woman with her medicine?" Inside the box lay row upon row of carefully maintained ammunition, each bullet polished and arranged with meticulous precision. Beneath them, wrapped in oiled cloth, rested a Colt peacemaker that looked as well maintained as the day it was made. Miller had treated enough gunshot wounds to recognize a weapon that had seen use. "I may be old," Sarah said softly, checking the revolver's action with practiced ease, "but I've watched Carter's boys all afternoon. The tall one with the scar favors his left leg. Old injury, probably. The Mexican keeps his gun too high on his hip, slow draw. Their leader's got quick hands, sure enough, but his shots at the bottles behind the saloon were wild. No discipline." She shook her head disapprovingly. "His mama should have taught him better than that." A commotion from the street drew their attention. Through the front window, they could see two of Carter's gang harassing young Mary Thompson, the schoolteacher, as she hurried home. Sarah's expression hardened, a glimpse of the legendary Deadeye showing through her grandmotherly facade. "Doctor," she said, her voice taking on an edge that Miller hadn't heard in years, "I believe it's time for my evening constitutional. Would you be kind enough to send word to Billy? Tell him to remember what happened in '56. He'll know what it means." As Miller stepped out into the gathering darkness, he couldn't help but notice how Sarah's stooped posture had subtly straightened, how her movements had taken on a fluid precision that belied her age. The legend of Deadeye McKenzie might have faded into memory, but legends, like old habits, have a way of resurging when needed most. The night was about to remind Quick Hand Carter and his gang that in the Arizona Territory, appearances could be deceiving, and some lessons come at a terrible price. Billy Jenkins wiped down the bar with practiced efficiency, his weathered hands moving in slow, deliberate circles as he kept a careful eye on Carter's gang. 30 years hadn't dulled his memory of the day Sarah McKenzie had saved the bank and his life from the Clayton brothers. The message Dr. Miller had just delivered sent a familiar chill down his spine. "Remember '56. "Another round," Carter demanded, slamming his empty glass on the bar. The young gunslinger's cheeks were flushed with whiskey and false confidence. His gang sprawled around a corner table, their loud laughter masking the predatory calculation in their eyes. Through the window, the last rays of sunlight painted long shadows across the street. "Mighty interesting town you got here," Carter drawled, leaning against the bar. "Funny how nobody mentioned that old widow woman when we asked about who holds influence round these parts." His fingers drummed restlessly near his holster. "Woman that age, living alone, probably got herself a nice nest egg tucked away somewhere." Billy's hand tightened imperceptibly on his cleaning rag. "Mrs. McKenzie. She's just a widow who mends clothes. Nothing special about her, except maybe her garden." The lie felt bitter on his tongue, but he knew Sarah's game. Let them underestimate her. It's what they'd done in '56, and 5 Clayton brothers had learned their mistake the hard way. The saloon's batwing doors creaked open, admitting Mary Thompson, the schoolteacher. Her face was still flushed from her earlier encounter with Carter's men. She made her way determinedly to the bar, though Billy noticed how she gave the outlaw's table a wide berth. "Evening, Miss Thompson." Billy nodded, already reaching for the small bottle of medicinal brandy he kept for emergencies. "Don't usually see you in here. Mrs. McKenzie sent me," Mary replied quietly, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "Said to tell you she's planning to visit the cemetery. Good night. Said something about paying respects to old friends." The coded message wasn't lost on Billy. The cemetery lay on a rise overlooking both the bank and the main road, perfect position for someone who knew how to use a rifle. He'd seen Sarah use that position before, that night in '56 when she'd picked off the Clayton brothers one by one in the darkness. At the outlaws' table, Rico, the Mexican member of Carter's gang, was growing increasingly agitated. "We should move tonight, Jefe," he muttered in Spanish, not realizing Billy had picked up enough of the language over the years to understand. "The bank's night guard is alone, and the old woman's house would be easy." Carter silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Patience, amigo. Good things come to those who wait." His eyes tracked Mary as she left the saloon, brandy bottle clutched in her hand. "Besides, I want to know more about this widow woman. Something ain't right about her." As if on cue, Sarah McKenzie herself appeared on the street outside, moving slowly but purposefully toward the general store. Her reading glasses glinted in the failing light, and her shawl wrapped tightly against the evening chill. To anyone watching, she was the very picture of elderly vulnerability. "Watch this," Carter grinned, nodding to the scar-faced member of his gang. The man rose, adjusting his gun belt with deliberate menace, and stepped out onto the boardwalk. Billy felt his heart race, but forced himself to continue wiping the bar. He'd seen that same look in the Clayton brothers' eyes, right before Sarah had taught them the difference between speed and accuracy. Through the window, he watched the confrontation unfold, knowing that what seemed like a simple case of intimidating an old woman was about to become something far more dangerous. In the gathering dusk, Sarah McKenzie's slight figure seemed almost fragile against the backdrop of Copper Creek's weathered buildings. But Billy Jenkins knew better. He'd seen what happened when people mistook age for weakness, had watched Deadeye McKenzie make that lesson stick with hot lead and cold precision. As night settled over the town like a burial shroud, the air grew thick with tension. Soon, very soon, Quick Hand Carter and his gang would learn why some legends are whispered about in saloons across the territory, and why Deadeye McKenzie's reputation was built on more than just stories. The scarred outlaw's spurs rang against the wooden boardwalk as he approached Sarah McKenzie, his shadow stretching long and menacing in the fading light. "Evening, Grandma," he drawled, deliberately stepping into her path. "Seems mighty dangerous for a lady your age to be out alone at this hour." Sarah paused, her arthritic fingers tightening almost imperceptibly on her walking stick. To those watching from the saloon, she appeared appropriately timid, perhaps even frightened. But Billy Jenkins, still wiping the same spot on his bar, noticed how she'd positioned herself. Back to the wall, clear line of sight down the street, the walking stick held at just the right angle to be more than mere support. "I appreciate your concern, young man," Sarah replied, her Virginia accent thick as honey, "but I've been walking these streets since before you were born." Her eyes, sharp despite her years, caught the slight hesitation in his left leg. Just, as she'd noted earlier, an old injury, a weakness she filed away like ammunition in a cartridge belt. Inside the saloon, Carter watched the exchange with predatory interest. "Woman's got spirit," he remarked to Rico. "For her age." His hand rested casually near his gun, but his eyes never left the scene outside. Something about the old woman's posture nagged at his instincts like a half-remembered warning. The scarred man took another step closer, reaching out as if to grab Sarah's arm. "Maybe you need an escort. Make sure you get home safe." His words died in his throat as the tip of Sarah's walking stick pressed suddenly against his boot, right where boot met shin, where a quick thrust could send crippling pain through an already damaged leg. "My husband," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the evening quiet. "God rest his soul. Always said there were two kinds of men in this world, those who respect their elders and those who need to be taught respect." The walking stick hadn't moved, its pressure a silent promise. "Which kind are you, young man?" For a moment, the tableau held. The scarred outlaw, frozen in mid-reach, Sarah McKenzie's deceptively fragile figure, radiating a quiet authority that made the hair on the back of Billy's neck stand up. He'd seen that look before, right before. She'd dropped 3 Clayton brothers in less time than it took to draw a breath. Dr. Miller, watching from his office across the street, noticed how Sarah's stance had shifted subtly. Gone was the stooped posture of age. In its place was the balanced poise of a shooter, masked by years of practice at appearing harmless. He found himself reaching for his medical bag, wondering if he'd need it before the night was through. The douceur spell broke when Carter's voice rang out from the saloon doorway. "Leave the old lady be, Jack. We got time." His words carried a hidden meaning that made the scarred man step back, though his face twisted with suppressed rage. Sarah's walking stick returned to its seemingly innocent position. "Much obliged, Mr. Carter," she called, her voice once again that of a gentle grandmother. "Your mother must have raised you right, teaching you to look out for your elders." But there was something in her tone, a subtle edge that made Carter's smile falter slightly. As Sarah continued her way to the general store, Mary Thompson watched. From her schoolhouse window, remembering stories she'd heard whispered in the town's quieter corners. Tales of a woman who could shoot the flame off a match at 50 paces, who'd once held off a dozen Apaches with nothing but a Winchester and iron determination. Surely those couldn't be about sweet Mrs. McKenzie, who brought her fresh-baked cookies and helped grade papers. But there had been something in Sarah's stance during that confrontation, something that reminded Mary of a mountain lion she'd once seen. Appeared relaxed, yet ready to strike with lethal precision. The schoolteacher found herself wondering about the worn, smooth grip of the old peacemaker she'd glimpsed once, hidden beneath Sarah's knitting basket. As darkness settled over Copper Creek like a gambler's cards being dealt, the town held its breath. Quick-Hand Carter might have built his reputation on speed, but he'd never faced someone who'd learned that patience was a weapon sharper than any bullet. The real question wasn't whether there'd be violence. It was only a matter of when and who would be left standing when the smoke cleared. Inside the general store, old Tom Wilson watched Sarah McKenzie carefully select items from his shelves, a spool of thread, some dried beans, and peculiarly, several boxes of Winchester ammunition that she quietly added to her basket. Like most of Copper Creek's older residents, Tom remembered the days when Deadeye Mackenzie's name struck fear into the hearts of outlaws across 3 territories. "Heard there was some trouble outside," he ventured, keeping his voice low as he wrapped her purchases. "Carter's boys getting bold." "Trouble has a way of finding this town," Sarah replied, counting out coins with deliberate precision. "Remember, the summer of '54, when the Dawson gang thought they could use Copper Creek as their personal hunting ground?" Tom's weathered face creased in a grim smile. "As I recall, they found themselves being hunted instead. 5 men rode in, only 2 rode out." He paused, glancing toward the window where the saloon was visible across the street. "But that was a long time ago, Sarah. We were all younger then." "Age is funny thing, Tom," she said, her voice carrying that familiar steel beneath its gentle exterior. "Everyone sees the silver hair, the wrinkles, the way these old hands shake sometimes." She held up her right hand, showing the subtle tremor. "But they forget that experience doesn't fade, memory doesn't weaken, and some skills," she smiled, "some skills only get sharper with time." As if to underscore her words, a commotion erupted outside. Rico, Carter's Mexican lieutenant, had cornered young Jimmy Parker, the bank teller's son, demanding information about the bank's security. The boy, barely 16, was pressed against the wall, terror evident in his face. Sarah's reaction was so subtle that only Tom, who'd been watching for it, noticed. Her stance shifted microscopically, her right hand dropping to her side where the walking stick could become a weapon in less time than it took to blink. But before she could move, another figure stepped in. Billy Jenkins had emerged from the saloon, his barkeeper's apron still tied around his waist. "Boy's late for his supper," he called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that only decades in a frontier saloon could grant. "His mama sent me to fetch him." Rico's hand had strayed to his gun, but Quick-Hand Carter's voice cut through the tension. "Let him go, Rico. We got all the time in the world." The Mexican reluctantly stepped back, allowing Jimmy to scurry away. But his eyes locked with Sarah's through the store window, and something in her steady gaze made him unconsciously touch the cross hanging at his neck. "Your boys are getting careless, Mr. Carter," Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly. Across the street, "Frightening children isn't the mark of a true gunman." She stepped out onto the boardwalk, her basket of purchases held casually in one hand, the walking stick in the other. Carter crossed the street with fluid grace, his spurs singing with each step. Up close, Sarah could see the telltale signs she'd noticed earlier, the slight favoring of his right side, the way his gun belt rode just a fraction too low for optimal draw speed. "You seem mighty interested in my men's behavior, Mrs. McKenzie," he said, tipping his hat with mocking courtesy, for someone who's just a harmless widow. "I've lived in this town a long time, young man," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Seen a lot of men like you come and go. Some learned their lessons and left wiser, others—" She paused meaningfully. "Others left differently." The threat, veiled though it was, hung in the air between them. Carter's hand twitched near his, in holster, but something in Sarah's eyes, a predatory alertness that belied her aged appearance, made him hesitate. "Well then," he said finally, his smile not reaching his eyes, "here's hoping we all learn our lessons peacefully." He turned away, but Sarah's soft voice followed him. "Oh, there will be lessons learned tonight, Mr. Carter. Of that, you can be certain." As Sarah made her way home through the gathering dusk, the townspeople watched from behind curtained windows. They recognized the walk of a hunter, the measured stride of someone who had faced down death so many times it had become an old friend. The legend of Deadeye McKenzie was stirring, and Copper Creek held its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. As darkness settled over Copper Creek, Dr. Miller made his way through back alleys to reach Sarah's house, his medical bag clutched tightly. The town had grown unnaturally quiet, like a held breath before a thunderstorm. Through windows, he could see families huddled together, doors bolted against the coming violence. He found Sarah in her kitchen, methodically cleaning her Winchester by lamplight. The quilt that usually covered it lay discarded on a chair, no more pretense needed. Her movements were precise, each stroke of the cleaning rod accompanied by the soft click of arthritic joints. "You're planning something," he said, setting his bag on the table. It wasn't a question. "Carter sent his men to watch the cemetery," she replied, not looking up from her work. "They think they're being clever, setting up an ambush where they expect me to go." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, just like the Clayton brothers did, back in '56. Miller pulled up a chair, watching her practiced movements. "I've heard stories about that night, but never the whole truth. People say you took down 5 men in the dark, without firing a single wasted shot." Sarah's hands paused on the rifle. 6, actually. Everyone forgets about Joe Clayton. He tried to slip away during the fight, thought he could circle behind me. Her eyes grew distant with memory. Found him 3 days later, half a mile away, 1 shot, right through the heart. A knock at the back door interrupted them. Billy. Jenkins slipped in, followed by Tom Wilson and, surprisingly, young Jimmy Parker, his face still pale from his earlier encounter with Rico. "Carter's planning to hit the bank tonight," Billy reported, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah's steady hands. "Overhead, Rico and Jack talking. They think the town's too scared to put up a fight." Sarah nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "And the cemetery watch?" 4 men, Jimmy spoke up, his voice stronger than expected. "I followed them like you asked, Mrs. McKenzie. They're spread out along the ridge, watching both the road and your house." Sarah's eyes sparkled with approval. "Good boy. Your father taught you well about moving quiet." She turned to the assembled group. "Carter thinks he's clever, using my own tactics against me. Expects me to try the high ground, just like in the old days." "But you've got something else in mind," Miller guessed, recognizing the tactical glint in her eye. "Young Mr. Carter made 3 mistakes," Sarah said, sliding the cleaned rifle's action back with a satisfying click. "First, he assumed age had dulled my skills. Second, he divided his forces, thinking numbers would overwhelm a single shooter." She paused, checking the rifle's sight with practiced care. "But his biggest mistake was believing I'd fight the same way I did 30 years ago." The group leaned in as Sarah spread out a rough map of the town on her kitchen table. It showed positions carefully marked in her neat handwriting, escape routes, lines of sight, potential cover spots she'd been noting all day while pretending to be nothing more than an elderly widow doing her errands. "Carter's men at the cemetery are watching for a shooter on the ridge," she explained, her finger tracing routes on the map. They won't be looking down. Meanwhile, he'll expect the bank to be defended from the front, the usual positions. Her smile turned predatory. But Copper Creek has changed since the old days. We've added some new buildings, changed some sight lines, and I've had years to plan for nights like this. Outside, a coyote's howl echoed across the darkened town. To the watchers in the cemetery, it was just another night sound. But to those gathered in Sarah's kitchen, it was a signal. More of the town's old-timers were getting into position, remembering skills learned in harder years. "There's something else Carter doesn't know," Sarah said softly, reaching into a cabinet to withdraw a wooden box that held her old peacemaker. Something the Clayton brothers learned too late. She checked the revolver's action, the smooth movement, belying her arthritic hands. Deadeye McKenzie never worked alone. I just let them think I did. As her small council looked on, the legendary markswoman began laying out her plan. Tonight, Quickhand Carter would learn that sometimes the deadliest predator is the one you've already dismissed as harmless. In the saloon, Quickhand Carter was growing increasingly uneasy, though he masked it well behind swagger and whiskey. Something about the old woman's words kept needling at his memory, like a half-forgotten warning from his early days as a gunfighter. "Boss," Rico muttered, sliding onto the bar stool beside him. "Something ain't right. Been asking around about the widow. Nobody'll talk about her past, but they all got this look when her name comes up. Like they know something we don't." Carter took another drink, remembering the steady look in Sarah McKenzie's eyes. No fear, no uncertainty, just the calculated patience of a predator choosing its moment. "What about the cemetery crew, in position, watching the ridgeline like you ordered? If she tries anything like them stories we heard about the Clayton brothers?" Rico's voice trailed off as Billy Jenkins approached with a fresh bottle. "Interesting thing about stories," Billy said casually, setting down the whiskey. "Sometimes the ones that sound the most far-fetched turn out to be the God's honest truth." He began wiping down the bar with methodical strokes. "Take Deadeye McKenzie, for instance. They say she once shot a man in Tucson from so far away, folks thought he'd been struck by lightning." Carter's hand tightened on his glass. "Deadeye McKenzie, the female shooter from back in the 50s? A cold feeling began settling in his stomach. "Heard she died years ago." "Did you now?" Billy's voice carried a hint of amusement. "Funny thing about legends. They have a way of surprising you." He moved away to serve other customers, leaving Carter with uncomfortable thoughts. Outside, the moon had risen, casting silver light across Copper Creek's quiet streets. In the shadows between buildings, figures moved with careful purpose. Tom Wilson, positioning himself behind his store's false front, Jimmy Parker's father setting up in the church bell tower, other old-timers taking up strategic positions they'd clearly used before. At her house, Sarah McKenzie sat in her rocking chair, apparently dozing in the cool night air. Her Winchester rested across her lap, partially covered by a shawl. To Carter's men watching from the cemetery, she appeared to be nothing more than an elderly woman who'd fallen asleep on her porch. But Dr. Miller, concealed in the shadows of his office across the street, saw what they missed. Sarah's head was tilted at precisely the right angle to watch the main street's reflection in her front window. Her right hand, though seemingly relaxed, rested less than an inch from the rifle's trigger. "Time was," she'd told him earlier, "I'd have taken them head-on, trusted in speed and accuracy alone." A lifetime of experience had colored her voice. But age teaches you patience, teaches you that the best shot isn't always the first one you see. In the saloon, Carter finally placed what had been bothering him about the widow. It wasn't just her steady gaze or the way she handled that walking stick. It was the way she moved, economical, precise, every motion serving a purpose. He'd seen that kind of movement before, in retired gunfighters who'd survived long enough to grow old. "Rico," he called sharply, "get Jack and check on that bank guard again. Something about this don't feel right. But as Rico stood to leave, the saloon's batwing doors burst open. One of the cemetery watchers staggered in, blood streaming from a shallow graze across his temple. "Boss!" he gasped. "Anderson and Peters, they're down! Never saw it coming, just 2 shots out of nowhere." Carter was on his feet instantly, gun clearing leather. "Where'd the shots come from? The ridge?" The wounded man shook his head, confusion evident. "That's just it, boss. Shots came from below, like the shooter was in town somewhere. But there's nobody on the streets, and that old woman's still asleep on her porch." In the sudden silence that followed, Billy Jenkins's quiet chuckle drew every eye in the saloon. "Might want to ask yourself something, Mr. Carter," he said, reaching beneath the bar. "In all those stories about Deadeye McKenzie, did anyone ever mention which eye was her shooting eye?" Outside, Sarah McKenzie's rocking chair creaked softly in the night breeze. The game had begun, and 30 years hadn't changed one simple truth. In Copper Creek, legends didn't die. They just waited for the right moment to remind folks why they became legends in the first place. Carter's mind raced as Billy Jenkins' words sank in. Deadeye McKenzie, the legend whose stories he'd dismissed as tall tales, whose shooting feats were still whispered about in saloons across the territory. And all this time she'd been right. In front of them, playing the role of a harmless widow. "Rico," he barked, "get everyone inside, now!" But even as the words left his mouth, 2 more shots rang out from somewhere in the darkness. Precise, deliberate. The sound of Rico's horse screaming in pain told him their escape routes were already being methodically cut off. "Boss!" Jack called. From the window, his scarred face pale in the lamplight. "Thompson and Rodriguez ain't responding from their posts. Streets look empty, but—" He swallowed hard. "Every time I try to get a better look, I swear I see movement in 3 different places at once." In her kitchen, Sarah McKenzie calmly reloaded her Winchester, her arthritic fingers moving with practiced efficiency. Dr. Miller watched in fascination as she checked each bullet with the same care she'd once used to mend the town's children's. "Clothes. My husband," she said softly, as if sharing a cherished memory, "taught me something important about strategy. Said it wasn't enough to outshoot your opponent. You had to outthink them too." She smiled, the expression making her look decades younger. "Carter's men are used to fast draws and straight fights. They don't understand the patience that comes with age." Across town, the bank stood quiet in the moonlight. To anyone watching, it appeared unguarded, exactly as Sarah had planned. She knew Carter's type, knew he'd eventually get desperate enough to make a run for it. When he did, the killing ground she'd prepared would be waiting. "You've been planning this for years, haven't you?" Miller asked, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Every new building, every repair to the old ones, you were setting up firing positions, creating corridors they'd have to use." "A woman my age has to think ahead," Sarah replied, her voice carrying that steel edge that had made her famous. "Carter's not the first to think Copper Creek would be easy pickings, and he won't be the last. But tonight, we remind them why this town has stayed peaceful for so long." In the saloon, Carter was beginning to understand the trap he'd walked into. His men, used to being the hunters, found themselves jumping at shadows. Every window, every doorway could hide a shooter. The old widow's words came back to haunt him. "Some skills only get sharper with time." "We still outnumber them," he insisted, trying to rally his men's courage. "It's just one old woman and a few townspeople." Billy Jenkins' quiet laugh drew their attention again. "You know what the Clayton brothers' last words were?" he asked, still calmly wiping glasses behind the bar. "Right before Sarah put them in the ground? It's just one woman." Funny how history has a way of repeating itself. Outside, another shot cracked through the night, deliberate, unhurried. The distinctive sound of a Winchester, followed by a cry of pain from the direction of the stables. Sarah's voice carried clearly in the aftermath. "That's your horse wrangler down, Mr. Carter. Non-fatal, but he won't be riding tonight." Carter felt cold sweat on his neck. The voice had come from the opposite direction of the last shot. Either she was moving incredibly fast for her age, or she's not alone, he realized aloud, pieces falling into place. She never was. The whole damn town is in on it. Now he's getting it, Billy nodded, reaching beneath the bar. The shotgun he produced was old, but well-maintained. You boys really should have asked yourselves why a town this size, this remote, never seemed to have trouble with outlaws. Why folks like the Clayton brothers and the Dawson gang just seemed to disappear after passing through. Another shot rang out, followed by Sarah's voice from yet another direction. Time's running out, Mr. Carter. Sun'll be up in a few hours, and Sheriff Cooper's due back at dawn. How do you want this to end? In the sudden silence that followed, Carter realized he could hear his own heartbeat loud in his ears. The legend of Deadeye McKenzie was no longer just a story. It was a noose, slowly tightening around his neck, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea how to shoot. His way out of it. The moon had climbed higher over Copper Creek, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. From his position near the saloon window, Carter watched his carefully laid plans unravel like a cheap sweater. 3 of his men were down. The horses were scattered or injured, and the old woman, the legend he hadn't recognized, was systematically cutting off every escape route. "Jack," he called softly, "take Rico and try for the bank. Maybe we can still salvage something from this mess." His scarred lieutenant hesitated, fear evident in his eyes for the first time since Carter had known him. "Boss," Jack whispered, "you don't understand. I heard stories about Deadeye McKenzie when I was just starting out. They say in the Battle of Wilson's Creek, she held off 15 men by herself, made every shot count, never wasted a bullet." "That was 30 years ago," Carter snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. Through the window, he could see Sarah's rocking chair still moving gently on her porch, the old woman apparently dozing. But now he noticed what he'd missed before. The chair was rocking with too perfect a rhythm, like it was being moved by something other than its occupant. In her kitchen, Sarah worked with methodical precision, checking her Winchester's action one final time. Dr. Miller watched as she laid out spare ammunition with the same care she once used to arrange her sewing supplies. "You knew they'd try for the bank eventually," he said. "It wasn't a question." Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with tactical awareness. Men like Carter, they can't help themselves. Even when they know it's a trap, their greed overrides their good sense. She smiled, the expression making her look momentarily young again. That's what happened to the Clayton brothers. They knew something was wrong, but they couldn't walk away from what they thought was easy money. Across the street, Tom Wilson had positioned himself perfectly in the shadows of his store's upper floor. He remembered the lessons Sarah had taught them all over the years, how to use moonlight to blind an opponent, how to time shots to mask their location, how to make one defender seem like many. "Your men are getting nervous, Mr. Carter," Sarah's voice carried clearly through the night, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Why don't you tell them about the time you shot Tom Blackwood, the one they call your fastest draw?" Carter felt his blood run cold. Nobody knew about that. Fight. About how he'd actually shot Blackwood in the back while the man was ordering a drink. "Oh yes," Sarah continued, her voice moving to a new location. "I know all about that. Just like I know about the bank guard in Yuma and the rancher's wife in Tucson. You see, Mr. Carter, while you were building your reputation, I was watching, learning, waiting." Billy Jenkins caught Carter's eye from behind the bar, his expression knowing. "She's been doing this longer than you've been alive, son. Every shot you've ever fired, every man you've killed, they're just practice rounds compared to her experience." Another shot rang out, followed by a cry of pain from the direction of the bank. Sarah's voice came again, calm and measured. "You're safe, cracker down, Mr. Carter. Don't worry, he'll live. I just made sure he won't be using those clever fingers of his for a while." Carter's remaining men huddled closer together, their earlier bravado replaced by primitive fear. They were used to straight fights, to quick draws and charging attacks. This slow, methodical dismantling of their forces was something entirely different. "You're trapped in here with us," Carter shouted, trying to maintain control of his men. A soft chuckle floated through the night air. "Oh no, Mr. Carter, you've got that backwards. You're trapped in here with me, and I've had 30 years to plan exactly how this night would go." As if to emphasize her words, another shot cracked through the darkness. Another horse screamed. Another escape route closed. In the saloon, Carter felt sweat running down his back as he realized the truth. They weren't just fighting an old woman with a rifle. They were facing a legend who'd spent 3 decades preparing for this exact moment. Desperation began to seep into the saloon like morning fog, thick and heavy. Carter's men, now bunched together near the bar, jumped at every creak of the building's old timber. Rico, usually the steadiest of the bunch, had taken to crossing himself every time Sarah's voice drifted through the night air. "You want to know something interesting about the Clayton brothers?" Billy Jenkins said, still calmly polishing glasses behind the bar. "They thought they had her figured out too, set up ambush positions just like you did, thought they could outsmart her." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Found the last one 3 days later, half a mile from town. Clean shot through the heart." Carter felt the walls closing in. Through the window, he could see Sarah's porch was now empty, the rocking chair still moving with that uncanny rhythm. His tactical mind, honed by years of planning heists, frantically searched for options. "The bank," he muttered, more to himself than his men. "If we can just reach the bank, get the payroll—" "Interesting choice of words," Sarah's voice came. "From somewhere in the darkness. That's exactly what Joe Clayton said, right before he tried to make a run for it. The stories never mention him, do they? Most folks think there were only 5 Clayton brothers. In his office, Dr. Miller was preparing bandages, knowing they'd be needed before the night was through. "You're enjoying this," he said quietly as Sarah slipped in through the back door to reload. "Not enjoying, Doctor," she corrected, checking her Winchester with practiced ease. "Teaching. Every generation needs to learn that Copper Creek isn't the easy target they think it is." Her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the street through his window. "Though I'll admit, there's a certain satisfaction in watching Carter realize just how badly he underestimated us." A shot rang out suddenly. Not Sarah's Winchester this time, but one of Carter's men firing blindly at shadows. The bullet splintered. Woods somewhere in the darkness, followed by Sarah's calm voice. "That's one less bullet you have, son. Better make the rest count." Inside the saloon, Jack grabbed Carter's arm. "Boss, we gotta surrender. This ain't a normal fight. She's not trying to kill us. She's playing with us like a cat with mice." But Carter shook him off, his pride warring with his growing fear. "She's just one old woman." "No," Billy interrupted, his voice carrying unexpected authority. "She's Deadeye McKenzie, the woman who once held off an entire Apache war party with just a Winchester and moonlight. The shooter who taught half the lawmen in the territory how to track and kill. And most importantly—" He leaned forward, his eyes. "Odd, she's the guardian of Copper Creek who spent 30 years preparing for nights exactly like this." As if to emphasize his words, another shot cracked through the night. Another horse screamed, another option eliminated with surgical precision. "Tell them about Tucson, Mr. Carter." Sarah's voice drifted in, now seeming to come from directly. "Outside the saloon's doors. Tell them how you built your reputation. Tell them about the men you shot in the back, the women you widowed, the children you orphaned." Carter's remaining men turned to look at him, doubt creeping into their eyes. The legend they'd dismissed as an old woman's tale was systematically stripping away not just their escape routes, but their leader's carefully constructed facade. "You see," Sarah continued, her voice moving again, "that's the difference between us, Mr. Carter. You built your legend on lies and ambush. I built mine on patience and precision, and tonight another shot rang out, taking the hat off Jack's head with millimeter precision. We're going to see which legend survives. In the sudden silence that followed, Carter realized something that chilled him to his core. The shots weren't random. Each one had been carefully placed, deliberately timed. She wasn't just cutting off their escape. She was herding them, manipulating their movements like a shepherd steering sheep. And as the moon climbed higher over Copper Creek, Carter finally understood. They weren't trapped in the saloon. They were exactly where Deadeye McKenzie wanted them to be. The first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Rico finally broke. The Mexican gunman had watched too many of his companions fall to Sarah's precise shots, had heard too many stories about Deadeye McKenzie's legendary accuracy whispered in the growing darkness. "To hell with this," he muttered, making a desperate break for the saloon's back door. Carter reached for him but was too late. "Rico, wait!" Jack called out, but the warning died in his throat as a single shot rang out. Rico stumbled, clutching, his thigh where Sarah's bullet had found its mark with surgical precision. "That was foolish, Mr. Rico." Sarah's voice carried clearly through the pre-dawn air. "Though I do appreciate you helping me demonstrate something to your friends." A pause, then. "Notice how I hit exactly what I aimed for. No fatal wounds, no stray shots. Every bullet exactly where I want it." Dr. Miller, watching from his office window, saw Rico crawl to relative safety behind a water trough. The wound was clean, painful but not life-threatening, just like all the others Sarah had delivered throughout the night. "You're sending them a message," he observed as Sarah reloaded beside him, "showing them you could kill them if you wanted to." "Fear of death is a powerful thing," Sarah replied, checking her sights with practiced care. "But fear of precision can be even more effective. They know now that every wound, every shot is deliberate, that I'm choosing to let them live." Inside the saloon, Carter's remaining men had reached their breaking point. They'd seen too many impossible shots, heard too many secrets from there. Past revealed by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Listen to me carefully, Mr. Carter." Sarah's voice cut through their growing panic. "Sheriff Cooper will be riding in at dawn. I can end this two ways." Another shot rang out, splitting a bottle on the bar inches from Carter's hand. "Either you and your men surrender now, face justice for your crimes, or what?" Carter shouted, his earlier bravado cracking. "Or I start aiming for something other than legs and arms." The steel in her voice made even Billy Jenkins shiver behind his bar. "You've got exactly 10 minutes to decide, and just to help you make up your mind." 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, each one progressively closer to Carter's position. The last bullet took a lock of his hair, demonstrating a level of accuracy that seemed impossible for anyone, let alone a woman in her 70s shooting in pre-dawn darkness. "That's just a taste," Sarah continued, her voice now seeming to come from directly above them. "Want to know something interesting about the Clayton brothers' last stand? They made the mistake of thinking they could wait me out. Thought surely I'd get tired, that age would slow me down." Tom Wilson's voice joined hers from another direction. "Found 2 of them right there in the saloon, exactly where you're standing now, Mr. Carter. Clean shots, right through their gun hands. Never even got to clear leather." "You don't understand," Carter called out, desperation evident in his voice. "We've got hostages, the whole saloon." Billy Jenkins' laugh cut through the tension. "Do you now?" He stepped back from the bar, revealing the shotgun he'd kept ready all night. Around the saloon, other hostages produced weapons they'd kept hidden, all aimed at Carter's diminishing group. Last mistake the Clayton brothers made, Sarah's voice came again, now from yet another direction. They never realized that in Copper Creek, everyone's part of the defense. Every rancher, every shopkeeper, every supposedly helpless citizen. The eastern sky was growing lighter by the minute. Soon the sun would rise over Copper Creek, and with it would come Sheriff Cooper and his deputies. Carter looked at his remaining men, saw the defeat in their eyes, the growing realization that they'd walked into something far more dangerous than a simple bank heist. "Time's running out, Mr. Carter," Sarah called out one final time. "And I should mention, I've saved my best shots for last. Care to see what 30 years of practice looks like when I'm really trying?" Sheriff Cooper's arrival brought with it the full light of morning, along with a dozen deputies eager to hear the story of how the infamous Carter gang had been brought down. They found Sarah McKenzie calmly sipping coffee at her usual table in the saloon, her Winchester resting within easy reach, while Billy Jenkins recounted the night's events to an increasingly amazed audience. "You mean to tell me," Cooper said, looking at the captured outlaws being loaded into wagons outside, "that you took down Carter's entire gang without a single fatality?" His eyes shifted to Sarah with newfound respect. "Even the stories about Deadeye McKenzie usually involved at least a few bodies." Sarah set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "People remember the shots that kill, Sheriff, but the truly difficult ones are those that wound without crippling, that stop without destroying." Her eyes, though tired from the long night, still held that predatory sharpness. "Anyone can kill. The real skill is in knowing when not to." Dr. Miller had his hands full, tending to the various wounds Sarah had inflicted throughout the night. Each one was precisely placed. Painful enough to incapacitate, but clean and easily treatable. Even Rico's thigh wound, though it would keep him from riding for weeks, would heal without complications. "You've changed since the Clayton brothers," the doctor observed as he worked. "Back then you showed no such mercy." "Those were different times," Sarah replied, watching Carter being led away in chains. "And they'd killed my husband. Some debts can only be paid in blood." She flexed her hands, the morning sun highlighting the arthritis-swollen joints. "But time teaches you things, if you live long enough to learn." Word of the night's events spread through Copper Creek like wildfire. Townspeople emerged from their homes to see the legendary gunfighters who'd terrorized the territory being marched away by Cooper's deputies. Young Jimmy Parker was already regaling anyone who would listen with tales of how he'd helped track Carter's men in the cemetery. "You knew," Mary Thompson said, approaching Sarah's table. "You knew they'd come eventually. That's why you taught us all those things over the years. The signals, the shooting positions, the ways to move unseen in our own town." Sarah nodded, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Every town needs a defense, child. Some use walls, some use laws. We use knowledge, passed down and kept quiet until it's needed." She reached out to pat Mary's hand. "And now you'll pass it on to the next generation, just as I did." Cooper pulled up a chair, his expression thoughtful. "The territorial marshal will want to speak with you. Carter's got quite a bounty on his head, and his gang's wanted in 3 states. "The bounty goes to the town," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Put it toward that schoolhouse Mary's been wanting to build." She rose slowly, her movements showing the wear of the long night. "I've got something better than money, Sheriff. I've got a peaceful town and neighbors I can trust." As she made her way home through the morning bustle, Sarah could feel the change in how people looked at her. The facade of the harmless widow had been stripped away, revealing the legend beneath. But instead of fear, she saw respect in their eyes and something more. Understanding, Dr. Miller fell into step beside her. "You know, more stories will come now. The legend of Deadeye McKenzie will grow even larger." "Let it," Sarah replied, pausing to watch the sunrise paint the mountains. "Gold. Every legend serves a purpose, Doctor. Mine reminds folks that Copper Creek isn't the easy target they might think it is." She smiled, the expression making her look momentarily young again, "and that some of us old-timers still have a few tricks up our sleeves." At her house, she found her rocking chair still swaying gently in the morning breeze, moved by the clever system of ropes and pulleys she'd rigged the night before. Another trick learned from decades of experience, another piece of wisdom earned through years of patience. Sheriff Cooper's arrival brought with it the full light of morning, along with a dozen deputies eager to hear the story of how the infamous Carter gang had been brought down. They found Sarah McKenzie calmly sipping coffee at her usual table in the saloon, her Winchester resting within easy reach, while Billy Jenkins recounted the night's events to an increasingly amazed audience. "You mean to tell me," Cooper said, looking at the captured outlaws being loaded into wagons outside, "that you took down Carter's entire gang without a single fatality?" His eyes shifted to Sarah with newfound respect. "Even the stories about Deadeye McKenzie usually involved at least a few bodies." Sarah set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "People remember the shots that kill, Sheriff, but the truly difficult ones are those that wound without crippling, that stop without destroying." Her eyes, though tired from the long night, still held that predatory sharpness. "Anyone can kill. The real skill is in knowing when not to." Dr. Miller had his hands full, tending to the various wounds Sarah had inflicted throughout the night. Each one was precisely placed, painful enough to incapacitate, but clean and easily treatable. Even Rico's thigh wound, though it would keep him from riding for weeks, would heal without complications. "You've changed since the Clayton brothers," the doctor observed as he worked. "Back then, you showed no such mercy." "Those were different times," Sarah replied, watching Carter being led away in chains. "And they'd killed my husband. Some debts can only be paid in blood." She flexed her hands, the morning sun highlighting the arthritis-swollen joints. "But time teaches you things, if you live long enough to learn." Word of the night's events spread through Copper Creek like wildfire. Townspeople emerged from their homes to see the legendary gunfighters who terrorized the territory being marched away by Cooper's deputies. Young Jimmy Parker was already regaling anyone who would listen with tales of how he'd helped track Carter's men in the cemetery. "You knew," Mary Thompson said, approaching Sarah's table. "You knew they'd come eventually. That's why you taught us all those things over the years, the signals, the shooting positions, the ways to move unseen in our own town." Sarah nodded, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Every town needs a defense, child. Some use walls, some use laws. We use knowledge, passed down and kept quiet until it's needed." She reached out to pat Mary's hand. "And now you'll pass it on to the next generation, just as I did." Cooper pulled up a chair, his expression thoughtful. "The territorial marshal will want to speak with you. Carter's got quite a bounty on his head, and his gang's wanted in 3 states. "The bounty goes to the town," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Put it toward that schoolhouse Mary's been wanting to build." She rose slowly, her movements showing the wear of the long night. "I've got something better than money, Sheriff. I've got a peaceful town and neighbors I can trust." As she made her way home through the morning bustle, Sarah could feel the change in how people looked at her. The facade of the harmless widow had been stripped away, revealing the legend beneath. But instead of fear, she saw respect in their eyes, and something more. Understanding. Dr. Miller fell into step beside her. "You know, more stories will come now. The legend of Deadeye McKenzie will grow even larger." "Let it," Sarah replied, pausing to watch the sunrise paint the mountains. "Gold. Every legend serves a purpose, Doctor. Mine reminds folks that Copper Creek isn't the easy target they might think it is." She smiled, the expression making her look momentarily young again. "And that some of us old-timers still have a few tricks up our sleeves." At her house, she found her rocking chair still swaying gently in the morning breeze, moved by the clever system of ropes and pulleys she'd rigged the night before. Another trick learned from decades of experience, another piece of wisdom earned through years of patience.